They say the Grand Canyon doesn't keep secrets, but it does. It hides them in its walls, buries them beneath layers of stone, and lets time do the rest. For generations, people have come here searching for beauty, and some never return. On June 12th, 2016, the Monroe family drove north from their home in Flagstaff, Arizona. It was a clear summer morning, the kind that makes every plan seem safe. James Monroe, an engineer who checked everything twice, had mapped the route the night before. His wife, Laura, packed sandwiches and sunscreen. Their two sons, Ethan and Caleb, fought over the window seat like brothers always do. Nothing about that day felt extraordinary. By nightfall, their SUV was still parked at the overlook. By the next morning, search teams were combing the canyon with drones, dogs, and helicopters. By the end of the week, their faces were on every local news station. At first, people thought it was another lost hiker story, a wrong turn, a twisted ankle, maybe an unexpected storm, but the Monroes were careful, experienced, familiar with the area. And as days turned into weeks, hope began to feel like denial. The canyon gave back nothing, no trail, no gear, not even a footprint. It was as if four people had been lifted straight out of existence. The story spread across the country. Reporters camped outside the park gates. Strangers mailed letters of support. Volunteers flew in from neighboring states to join the search. But after 2 months of endless grids and unanswered calls, the operation was suspended. The Monroe family was gone, swallowed by the same beauty they'd come to admire. 9 years passed, the world moved on. The headlines faded, but not for everyone. On a quiet September morning, 2 hikers drifted down a remote stretch of the Colorado River, the kind of place few ever see. As sunlight crept over the cliffs, one of them noticed a flash of blue wedged between 2 canyon walls. At first, he thought it was trash, a piece of plastic washed down by rain. Then he looked closer. It was a small backpack, sun-bleached, torn at the strap, and the size a child might carry. For 9 years, there were only theories, but what those hikers found that morning would force everyone to look again and change everything we thought we knew about what really happened to the Monroe family. Flagstaff, Arizona, June 2016. The morning light spilled gently through the kitchen window, painting soft stripes across the table where Laura Monroe poured 2 mugs of coffee. The smell of toast and sunscreen filled the small house, that familiar mix that meant the start of summer. Outside, the sky was bright, clear, and endless. It was the kind of morning that made everything feel simple and safe. Ethan Monroe, 13, sat at the counter double-checking his backpack. Compass, first aid kit, 2 bottles of water, flashlight, a folded map he'd studied for weeks. He packed with the precision of someone far older than his age, like a boy trying to prove he could keep his family safe. Caleb, 10, came clattering down the stairs barefoot, his laughter echoing through the hall. He carried his sneakers in one hand, half a granola bar in the other. Where Ethan was careful, Caleb was chaos, the kind of energy that never stopped moving. "Slow down, buddy," Laura said, catching the flying shoe before it hit the wall. "You'll wake the whole neighborhood." James looked up from his mug and smiled. Let him burn it off now. He'll sleep the whole drive anyway. That was their rhythm, gentle teasing, easy smiles, the kind of small talk that fills ordinary mornings when no one knows how precious ordinary is. Ethan slipped his backpack on and checked his phone for the trail map one last time. "Mom, you packed the sandwiches, right?" Laura nodded. "Turkey for you, peanut butter for your brother, and extra water." "See, Ethan?" Caleb said with a grin. "Mom's got it handled. You don't have to act like we're crossing the Sahara." The room filled with laughter. James ruffled Caleb's hair, and Laura kissed Ethan's forehead before heading to the car with the cooler. It was all so normal, a family with plans, a bright day ahead, nothing to fear. As they loaded into their silver SUV, the brothers argued over the playlist. Caleb begged for something loud and upbeat. Ethan wanted silence so he could focus on navigation. Laura chose the middle ground, a classic rock station that hummed quietly in the background as they pulled onto the open highway. The landscape shifted as they drove north, from tidy suburban streets to stretches of pine forest and red earth. Every few miles, the boys leaned against the windows, watching the cliffs rise in the distance. "Is that the canyon already?" Caleb asked. "Not yet," James replied, glancing at the GPS. "Still about an hour. You'll know when you see it." The boys fell quiet, the car filling with the steady hum of tires on asphalt. Laura rested her hand over James's on the gear shift, a small gesture that spoke of years of partnership, of comfort built through ordinary days just like this. By the time they reached the Marble Ridge overlook, the sun was high and warm. A ranger waved them through the gate, and the air grew cooler with elevation. The family stretched their legs, taking in the endless horizon before them. Ethan adjusted the straps of his backpack and studied the map again. "Trailhead's that way," he said confidently. Caleb, bouncing on his heels, pointed to a narrow dirt path that curved toward the trees. "Can we go down there first? It looks more fun." James squinted, assessing it. "That's not the official route, bud. Maybe another time." But Caleb's curiosity had already been sparked. He peered into the trees, eyes wide with the kind of wonder only children still have. Laura laughed softly. "We'll see. Let's get moving before it gets too hot." They started down the marked trail, their voices fading into the canyon's quiet. It was the last time anyone would see them. If anyone had told them that morning how it would end, they would have laughed, because nothing felt dangerous, not yet. The parking area at Marble Ridge was small and quiet, tucked away from the main viewpoints where tourists gathered for pictures and souvenirs. This part of the South Rim didn't have gift shops or paved walkways, just dust, wind, and the low hum of cicadas hiding in the brush. It was the kind of place where silence pressed close, and even your own footsteps sounded out of place. James parked the SUV under a patch of thin shade. The family stepped out, stretching their legs, the boys squinting against the glare of the late morning sun. Ethan unfolded his paper map, flattening it on the hood. His finger traced the path from the trailhead to a spot marked Ridge Point Overlook. It wasn't far. 2 miles out, 2 miles back. "This is the route," he said, proud of his research. "We'll get great views by lunchtime." Caleb wasn't listening. He had already wandered a few steps away, pointing toward a narrow dirt path that wound between two clusters of rocks. The entry was half hidden by shrubs, barely wide enough for one person. "Hey, Dad, what about this one?" Caleb called out. "It looks cooler." James walked over, shading his eyes. The trail looked faint, carved more by footsteps than by maintenance. "That's not on the map," he said. "Probably just an animal path or a shortcut." Caleb grinned. "We could just check it out for a few minutes." Ethan frowned. "That's not how navigation works." Laura stepped between them, smiling. "How about we take a quick look, and if it gets rough, we turn back? No harm in exploring a little." James hesitated. The trail did seem harmless at first, dry, firm, and leading toward what looked like another ridge. "All right," he said at last, tightening his pack straps. 5 minutes, then back to the main trail. Everyone stays together." The first few minutes were easy. The boys walked ahead, laughing, tossing small pebbles into cracks in the rocks. The path dipped and rose gently, weaving between clusters of juniper trees. A hawk circled overhead, its shadow gliding over the canyon walls. Everything felt calm, too calm. After about 10 minutes, the trail began to twist, narrowing until they had to walk single file. The shrubs thickened, their branches scraping against legs and arms. The air felt heavier, the breeze gone. Even the insects seemed quieter here. "Are you sure this is still a trail?" Laura asked, glancing back toward where they'd come from. The entry point was already out of sight. Ethan looked at his compass. "We're still heading east," he said, but his voice carried less confidence now. He pulled out his phone to double-check the GPS. The signal icon flickered, then disappeared completely. "No service," he muttered. "I'll mark our direction manually." Caleb stopped beside a tall boulder, running his fingers along a strange carving in the rock, faded initials that looked decades old. "People have been here," he said. James studied it briefly. "Maybe, but this isn't on any ranger map, and for a reason." He scanned the horizon, but the canyon's shape had changed, the walls rising higher, the sky now a narrow strip above them. They kept walking, expecting the trail to open back up. Instead, it curved sharply between two walls of sandstone that rose taller with every step. The temperature climbed, the air trapped like heat inside a box. Caleb's energy started to fade. "Dad, how much longer?" "Not long," James answered automatically, though he wasn't sure anymore. The path began sloping downward, and the light changed, dimmer, redder, like dusk was settling in early. The canyon had a way of tricking time, of folding sunlight until it felt like another world. Ethan checked the compass again. "It's drifting. It's not stable here." James frowned. "That's just magnetic interference. The rocks here mess with readings." They stopped for water. The silence around them was immense. When the wind moved through the canyon, it made a low, hollow sound, almost like breathing. Laura brushed dust off her knees. "Let's head back," she said. "It's getting hotter." They turned around, but something strange happened. The path behind them didn't look the same. The landmarks they'd passed, the twisted tree, the pile of stones, were gone or hidden by shifting light. Caleb pointed toward what looked like their way out. "That's it, right?" James squinted. "I think so." But as they walked, the walls closed tighter, the sound of their steps echoing in a way it hadn't before. Ethan slowed, realizing the truth first. "Dad, this isn't the same trail." No one spoke for a moment. The air was still, the canyon holding its breath around them. Some trails don't appear on any map because they were never meant to be followed. By early afternoon, the sun had shifted to a harsher angle. The light no longer felt friendly. It pressed down, reflecting off the canyon walls in waves of heat. The family slowed their pace, their easy chatter gone. Every direction looked the same now: red rock, sand, and silence. Ethan led the way, still holding the map as though it could offer comfort, though he already knew it was useless. The thin paper trembled in his hands, edges soft with sweat. Caleb followed close behind, his backpack bouncing with every step, quieter now than he'd been all day. Behind them, James stopped again to check his compass. He tapped it lightly, frowning. The needle drifted lazily before spinning in a full, slow circle. "It's not working?" Laura asked. He shook his head. "The rock here must be throwing it off. Magnetic interference." "Then use the map," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. "The map only helps if we know where we are." Laura shaded her eyes, scanning the sky. "We're not far from the rim. We just need to keep heading west, The sun's that way. Ethan looked up from his compass app, which now showed nothing but a blank gray screen. The phone's dead too. No signal, no coordinates. James exhaled slowly. All right, we'll follow the sun. It'll lead us back. No one argued. They simply adjusted their packs and kept walking, trusting that the land would eventually open up again. But as they moved, the canyon seemed to fold in on itself. Narrower passages, steeper slopes, higher walls. The sound of the wind faded until all that remained was the crunch of their boots. Caleb finally spoke. Are we lost? Laura crouched beside him. We're just a little turned around, she said softly. It happens. Your dad knows what he's doing. Caleb nodded, though his wide eyes betrayed doubt. They pressed on. The air grew dry and metallic, tasting faintly of dust and iron. Every few minutes, James stopped to take another bearing, muttering under his breath. He wasn't the type to admit uncertainty, but his shoulders had begun to tense, his voice shorter each time he spoke. Ethan noticed it. Dad, maybe we should go back the way we came. James glanced at the canyon behind them, the long stretch of stone now cloaked in shadow. We've been walking for hours. I'm not sure which way that even is anymore. The words hung there heavy and final. Laura took a long breath. Let's rest for a minute, she said. We need water. They found a sliver of shade beneath a rock ledge. The relief was brief but welcome. Laura passed around a bottle, rationing sips. Caleb drank too quickly, earning a gentle reminder from Ethan to slow down. The sun lowered, slipping toward the edge of the canyon wall. The once bright sky deepened to a burnt orange, streaked with purple. James studied the ground, tracing faint footprints that could have been theirs, or anyone's. He turned to Laura, lowering his voice. If we don't find the main trail soon, we'll need to make camp. Her expression tightened. You said it was just a detour. I thought it was. They exchanged a look, one of those quiet, loaded glances between people who've been married long enough to communicate whole sentences without words. It wasn't anger yet. It was fear, pretending to be patience. Caleb kicked at the dirt. It's getting cold, he said. Ethan looked up. The sun was nearly gone now, the canyon walls turning deep red, then brown, then gray. Shadows pooled like water around their feet. For the first time, the stillness felt wrong. Even the birds had gone silent. Laura reached for James's hand. Let's stop here, she said softly. We'll wait for the light. He hesitated, but nodded. They dropped their packs near the ledge, exhaustion finally catching up. Ethan sat beside Caleb, pointing at the first stars appearing overhead. That's Polaris, he said quietly, the North Star, so we're facing north. Caleb followed his gaze, eyes wide. Then west is that way. Toward home? Ethan didn't answer. The air cooled fast. The desert heat vanished with the sun, leaving a thin chill that crept up their arms. Laura pulled her sons close beneath a blanket, her heart beat steady against theirs. For a moment, it almost felt peaceful again, like they were simply camping, like nothing was wrong. But above them, the canyon walls stood tall and unyielding, shadows growing deeper with every breath. They thought they were just a few wrong turns from safety. They didn't know they were hours away from disappearing. They settled beneath a shallow ledge just as the last of the daylight disappeared. The canyon, which had glowed red and gold an hour earlier, was now a deep, violet basin. The temperature dropped quickly, and their breath began to fog in the dim air. James cleared a small patch of ground, brushing away rocks with the side of his boot. This will do for now, he said, though it sounded more like a question than a statement. Laura didn't argue. She was too tired, too aware that they'd been walking for nearly 10 hours. Ethan found a spot against the wall and unzipped his pack. He pulled out the flashlight, the only one they had, and checked the batteries. The faint beam flickered weakly before holding steady. He swept it around the canyon, the light catching small fragments of quartz in the sand, making them sparkle like tiny stars. Caleb sat beside him, hugging his knees. "Are we going to sleep here?" "For now," Laura said gently. "We'll head back out in the morning when there's light." Caleb nodded, but his eyes darted toward the darkness beyond the ledge. Every sound, a shifting pebble, a gust of wind, made him flinch. He reached for his mother's hand. "Mom, I'm scared." Laura squeezed his fingers. "That's okay," she whispered. "It's all right to be scared. We just have to stay calm. Your dad and I are here." Ethan shifted closer to his brother. "We've got this," he said softly. "Remember what I said about survival stuff? First rule, you stay together." Caleb looked up at him, trying to smile. "You really think we'll find the car tomorrow?" Ethan nodded. "Yeah. Dad said the sun rises east, right? We just follow it back." James overheard, his expression unreadable in the half-light. He wanted to believe that too. Laura reached into her pack and took stock: half a bottle of water, 2 granola bars, and a few wrapped sandwiches that had gone warm hours ago. She broke one bar in half and passed it around. No one complained about the taste. Hunger made it sacred. The flashlight dimmed slightly. Ethan set it down between them, its light pooling weakly across their faces. The canyon walls seemed to draw closer at night, their edges blending into shadow. The air smelled of iron and dry earth. Caleb whispered, "It's so quiet." "It's the desert," James said. "Everything sleeps when it gets cold." But even he could feel the weight of that silence. It wasn't peaceful anymore. It was the kind that listens back. Laura tried to lighten the mood. "Remember that camping trip by Oak Creek? You boys wouldn't stop talking about ghost stories." Caleb smiled faintly. "Yeah, Ethan told the one about the lost ranger." Ethan rolled his eyes. "And you cried halfway through." They laughed, a small, fragile sound that seemed to echo off the stone. For a moment, it didn't feel like they were lost. They were just a family again, sharing warmth and stories under the stars. Time passed slowly. Above them, the canyon ceiling opened just enough to reveal a thin ribbon of sky. Stars appeared one by one, scattered and sharp. Ethan pointed toward the brightest. "That's Vega. You can use it to find direction." Caleb leaned against him. "You know everything." "Not everything," Ethan said, "but enough." James sat a few feet away, watching the stars flicker against the stone. He thought about the road back home, the unfinished deck project, the smell of coffee in the mornings, normal things, small things that suddenly felt distant and impossible. Laura rested her head on his shoulder. Neither spoke. There was nothing left to say. The flashlight finally dimmed to a faint amber glow before going out completely. Darkness wrapped around them, soft and heavy. The only sound was the wind curling through the canyon, brushing past the rocks like something alive. In the quiet, you could almost hear their breathing, slow, steady, huddled close. A family holding each other against the vastness of the night. They watched the stars through cracks in the canyon walls, not knowing that for anyone searching above, those same stars shone over an empty trail. The canyon was silent now, and somewhere in that silence, it was already beginning to keep its secret. By late morning the next day, the Marble Ridge parking area was empty except for one silver SUV. Its windows glinted in the sun, dust beginning to settle on the hood. Most hikers who started early had already returned, loading their cars with tired smiles and cameras full of photos. But the Monroe vehicle didn't move. Ranger Daniel Foster noticed it during his routine patrol, jotting down plate numbers on his clipboard. He recognized the local registration, Flagstaff plates, and assumed the family was still out on the trail. Still, when he came back 3 hours later and found the SUV in the same spot, something felt wrong. The sun was already starting to lower toward the western horizon, the air cooling as shadows stretched across the rocks. He radioed the station. "This is Ranger Foster at Marble Ridge. Got a vehicle still here since yesterday. Family of 4, judging by the car seats and supplies. No sign of them returning." There was a pause before dispatch answered. "Copy that. Initiate a standard welfare check. We'll alert search and rescue to stage a team near your location." Back in town, Laura's coworker at the hospital, Dr. Karen Patel, noticed her friend hadn't shown up for her Sunday shift. Laura was never late, never without calling. When calls went unanswered, she phoned James's office. His boss hadn't heard from him either. By late afternoon, both families were calling local authorities. At 5:42 p.m., the official report went out. Possible missing family. Monroe, 4 members, last seen entering Marble Ridge Trail. Within an hour, park rangers and volunteers began sweeping the main routes. Helicopters were requested before sundown to take advantage of the light. By 7:15, the rhythmic thump of rotors echoed over the canyon, blades cutting through the quiet evening sky. From the air, the Grand Canyon looked almost calm, endless waves of stone painted gold by the dying sun. The searchlight swept slowly across the terrain, beams sliding over cliffs and ridges that revealed nothing. On the ground, voices called into the emptiness. "James, Laura, Ethan, Caleb." Each shout bounced off rock and came back hollow. Footprints appeared, then disappeared in loose soil. The land offered only half-truths. By nightfall, a command post had been set up near the trailhead. Generators hummed, radios crackled, and volunteers signed in under portable floodlights. Coffee cups and folded maps covered the tables. Someone taped a printed photo of the Monroe family to a board marked "Active Case." Back in Flagstaff, neighbors gathered outside the Monroe home. The porch light was on, but no one answered the door. A half-finished cup of coffee sat on the kitchen counter. In the boys' shared room, their beds were unmade, clothes strewn across the floor, evidence of a life paused mid-sentence. By 10 that night, local news anchors were reading the first reports. A Flagstaff family of 4 has gone missing after a weekend hiking trip in Grand Canyon National Park. Authorities have launched an extensive search effort. Old photos flashed across the screen. Ethan holding his science fair ribbon, Caleb smiling beside a toy telescope, Laura and James standing behind them, their hands resting proudly on their son's shoulders. Strangers watching from their living rooms shook their heads, whispering things like, "How does that happen?" And they must have gotten turned around. The first night of the search stretched on with no answers. The wind carried dust across the floodlights, and one by one the volunteers settled near their trucks, waiting for morning. Meanwhile, far below the rim, the canyon lay in near total darkness. The ledge where the Monroes had camped the night before was empty now. Only faint footprints remained, half blown over by sand. The silence was complete, the kind that absorbs even the smallest sounds. The helicopters circled overhead, their searchlights tracing the vast curves of the canyon walls. From above, it all looked like art, beautiful, still, unmoving. But beauty has a way of hiding the truth. From the air, the Grand Canyon looks like a painting. From the ground, it swallows everything: sound, hope, even time. For 8 days they searched. From sunrise to well past midnight, the canyon buzzed with movement. Helicopters tracing flight paths in slow grids, search dogs sniffing through ravines, and volunteers forming long, hopeful lines along the ridge. Every rock, every dry creek bed, every narrow slot canyon was combed through again and again, maps filled with red circles, coordinates, and notes in fading marker ink. The first few days carried energy, that stubborn belief that the Monroes were alive, waiting somewhere. Search teams followed faint tracks that led nowhere, bits of fabric that turned out to be discarded wrappers, even rumors of voices heard echoing at dusk. Each lead dissolved into dust. By day 4, optimism thinned into exhaustion. James's engineering colleagues took unpaid leave to join the effort. Laura's coworkers at the hospital coordinated meal drops for volunteers. Reporters hovered near the command post, chasing updates that no one wanted to give. On the 7th day, the news anchor's tone had shifted. Words like rescue quietly became recovery. The story still ran during prime time, but by then, people had started to turn the channel. Ranger Daniel Foster stood beside his vehicle at dawn on the 8th morning. His boots were crusted with red clay, his voice hoarse from calling names into the wind. He'd memorized the terrain by then, every boulder, every ravine, but it hadn't mattered. The canyon had stayed silent. At noon, the announcement came through the radio. Command recommends suspending active search at 1800 hours. No one spoke for a long time. The canyon stretched below them, still and endless, as if listening. By evening, teams began packing up, folding tents, rolling cables, loading ATVs onto trailers. A few lingered, unwilling to leave. They kept their eyes on the horizon until the light faded and there was nothing left to see. Rain began the next morning. It came without warning, sudden and heavy, a curtain of water falling into the dry channels below. Within minutes, the dirt paths became streams, and those streams turned violent. Flash floods tore through the lower ridges, dragging branches, rocks, and debris down into the unseen depths. Every footprint, every trail marker, every possible clue was wiped clean. The Grand Canyon doesn't just hold secrets, it protects them. By the end of that week, the Monroe name had already started slipping from the headlines. New stories took their place. A fire near Prescott, a plane crash in Nevada. The cycle moved on, but one person didn't. Rachel Monroe, James's younger sister, refused to let it go. She was the one who'd answered the phone when the ranger called, the one who'd stood at the edge of Marble Ridge on the first night of the search, staring down into the dark. She moved to Flagstaff within a month, taking a teaching job at a local school just to stay close. Every weekend, she hiked the same trails, learning the land the way her brother once had. She met with rangers, weather experts, and rescue volunteers, collecting every fragment of information she could. People told her to move on, that it had been a tragic accident, that the desert takes what it wants. But Rachel never accepted silence as an answer. Every year on June 12th, she returned to the Overlook alone and laid 4 white stones side by side in the dust. She'd sit there for hours, eyes closed, listening to the wind whistle through the canyon walls. Sometimes she thought she heard something in it, a faint voice, a laugh, a name. But it always faded before she could be sure. She'd whisper the same words before leaving. If you're out there, I'm still looking. 9 summers passed that way. Seasons came and went. Tourists took photographs near the same overlook, unaware of the story buried beneath their feet. The canyon doesn't lie, it just refuses to speak. 9 years is a long time to live in one place for a single reason. Rachel Monroe had built an entire life in Flagstaff, but it wasn't really living. She rented a small apartment above a bookstore, taught part time at the community college, and kept to herself. Her students knew her as quiet but kind, the woman who always carried a folded map in her bag and wore a silver compass around her neck. What they didn't know was that every June she disappeared for 3 days without explanation. Each year, on the anniversary of her brother's last hike, Rachel drove out to Marble Ridge before sunrise. She'd park in the same faded spot her brother once did, place a small bouquet of desert lilies on the ground by the trail sign, and sit in silence. She never cried anymore. Grief had settled into something quieter, a weight she carried like an extra heartbeat. Sometimes hikers passing by would stop to ask if she needed help. She'd smile politely and say, "No, thank you. I'm just visiting family." In the early years, she organized volunteer searches every summer, small teams of locals, students, and park regulars who combed through drainages and ravines the official search had missed. But as time went on, fewer people showed up. Eventually, it was just her. Still, she kept going. She hiked with a notepad and compass, marking strange outcroppings, paths that looked newly cut, and any piece of debris she couldn't explain. The rangers had grown used to seeing her name on visitor logs. Monroe, R, became a fixture, like the canyon itself, always there, always searching. Years blurred into one another. Her hair turned silver at the temples. Friends stopped asking how she was doing. The world, as it does, moved forward, but for Rachel, time had stopped on that day in 2016. Every noise in the canyon still made her pause. The flap of wings, the crack of distant thunder, the rush of wind through the stone. She'd close her eyes and imagine her brother's voice echoing through it. 9 years after the Monroes vanished, the story had become a kind of local legend, whispered around campfires, printed in the occasional travel blog, and remembered only by those who refused to forget. Then, on a September morning, the canyon finally stirred. Far below the rim, the Colorado River ran slow and glassy, carving through the ancient rock like a vein of green. 2 kayakers paddled through the narrow stretch of Serpent Fork Canyon, a hidden channel known mostly to locals and geologists. Jake Wallace, a seasoned river guide, led the way. Behind him was Nora Patel, a biology student studying erosion patterns for her research project. They had launched before dawn, hoping to beat the rising heat. The air smelled of wet stone and mineral dust, sharp and clean. For hours the canyon had been silent, but for the rhythm of their paddles. Then Nora pointed toward a sheer cliffside just ahead. "Jake," she said, squinting, "do you see that?" He followed her gaze. High above the river, wedged between 2 vertical slabs of rock, something faintly blue broke the monotony of rust-colored stone. "Could be trash," Jake said at first, but his voice held a note of uncertainty. Even from a distance, it didn't look random. They drifted closer. The water slowed as they entered a shallow eddy, the canyon walls towering above them. The air cooled, and every sound grew louder. The echo of dripping water, the scrape of their paddles, their own breath. Nora tilted her head, trying to focus. "It's wedged in tight. Maybe a backpack?" Jake didn't answer right away. He knew the stories, had guided dozens of tourists through this area over the years. The Monroes, the mystery, the unanswered questions. Every ranger and river guide knew that name. He paddled closer to the wall, eyes narrowing. The color was unmistakable now. Faded sky blue, the kind used in children's hiking gear. Nora's voice dropped to a whisper. Jake, do you think it's... He nodded slowly. Yeah, I think it is. The current shifted beneath them, and for a moment the canyon fell utterly still. Sometimes the canyon gives something back, not out of mercy, but because it decides the time has come. The canyon narrowed until the river was no wider than a two-lane road. Towering walls of stone rose on either side, streaked with centuries of color. Reds, browns, pale creams, like layers of time itself. Jake Wallace slowed his kayak, squinting against the glare bouncing off the water. The patch of blue was still there, high above them, wedged into a deep crack between two slabs of sandstone. It was small, too small to be an old tent or gear bag. The sunlight caught on the fabric in flashes, as if the canyon was deliberately trying to draw their eyes to it. Nora drifted up beside him, her paddle slicing quietly through the water. That's not trash, she said. Her voice was soft, as though she didn't want to disturb the air. Jake's instincts agreed. He'd spent 15 years running rivers across the Southwest, and he'd seen what flood debris looked like, the broken, scattered randomness of it. This was different. It was too intact, too deliberate. Stay here, he said finally, steering toward a small outcropping of rocks near the base of the cliff. I'm going up for a look. Nora's eyes widened. That's at least 40 feet. He glanced up the wall. Yeah, I've done worse. He pulled his climbing gear from the kayak, a rope, harness, carabiners, a small pack, and began his ascent. The rock was hot to the touch, dry and rough against his palms. Halfway up, he stopped to secure his line, glancing down to where Nora waited, a tiny shape against the dark green of the river. As he climbed higher, the sound of the water faded. All he could hear was his own breathing and the steady scrape of his boots on stone. The smell of dust and mineral filled the air, sharp and old. When he finally reached the crevice, his heart began to pound. The object was exactly what he'd feared, a backpack, small, faded blue, the kind a child might wear for a day hike. The fabric was sun-bleached, frayed at the straps, and stiff from years of exposure. Jake rested one hand against the rock beside it, steadying himself. He stared at it for a long moment before touching it. It was wedged tightly, half buried in dried sediment and bits of debris. Tiny sticks, grains of sand, a strip of torn fabric that looked like part of a sleeve. Carefully, he freed it from the crack and brushed away the dust. The zipper was stiff, but still functional. Inside was a small camera, coated in grit but intact. Beside it, a folded paper map, brittle, edges curled and water-stained. And tucked into a side pocket, he found something that made his breath catch, a name tag, stitched in fading thread, the letters barely legible after years of sun and weather. Caleb Monroe. For a moment, he couldn't move. The world seemed to tilt around him, the heat, the stone, the impossible weight of that name. He'd heard it hundreds of times over the years, in ranger briefings, in stories from tourists who still whispered about the family that vanished without a trace. But this was real, tangible, proof that they hadn't simply disappeared. He called down, his voice carrying over the canyon. Nora, you need to radio this in, now. Her head jerked up. Is it? It's them, he said quietly. It's the Monroes. Below, Nora fumbled for the waterproof radio clipped to her vest, her hands shaking. This is Patel, field researcher, ID 7749. We're at Serpent Fork Canyon, about half a mile north of Marker 22B. Possible discovery related to the Monroe case. Request immediate dispatch. Static crackled. Then a calm voice answered, Copy that. Stay where you are. Rescue team en route. Jake stayed anchored to the wall, one arm hooked into the crevice. He stared again at the backpack, the way it had lodged itself perfectly in that narrow slit of stone. It looked as if it had been placed there, not dropped or thrown, but held. He imagined the flash floods that had swept through these canyons over the years, violent walls of water carrying trees, rocks, and debris like paper. How many storms had come and gone since that day? How many chances had there been for this little bag to vanish forever? And yet, it hadn't. He took a deep breath, whispering almost to himself, 9 years. And it's still here. The pack's contents told their own quiet story. The camera's memory card, sealed inside its waterproof casing. The folded trail map, its creases still sharp despite the stains. The name tag, hand-stitched, probably by a mother who'd wanted her son to keep his things safe. Jake held the backpack carefully against his chest. For a long time, he didn't climb down. He just stared at the horizon through the thin opening of the canyon, feeling the wind sweep past him, warm and steady. He'd been part of recoveries before, but never one that felt like this. Not a discovery, but a message. When he finally descended, Nora was waiting at the river's edge. Her expression said everything. Jake placed the pack gently on the rocks. They both stared at it, neither speaking. Above them, the afternoon sun began to fade, slipping behind the canyon rim. Shadows stretched long and cool across the walls. "It's so small," Nora said finally. "It looks like it's been waiting." Jake nodded slowly. "It has." For 9 years, it had sat there through floods, storms, and seasons, untouched, hidden in plain sight, waiting for someone to finally look up. They closed the river for the recovery. Boats were diverted to wider water, while a technical team anchored lines into the cliff and worked methodically along the wall. What Jake and Nora had seen from below became a careful grid, chalk marks, numbered flags, photographs, taken from 3 angles before anyone touched a single thing. The backpack came down first, lowered in a clear evidence bag that turned in the wind like a lantern. Then a second find, the remains of a small shoe lodged on a ledge 20 feet to the left, its sole worn thin, the laces hardened with time. Farther up, caught on a thorn of rock, hung a strip of torn nylon, sun-faded, threadbare at the edge. Investigators would later say it was consistent with lightweight shelter fabric, the kind people carry for emergencies and hope never to use. At the command tent on the riverbank, they opened the backpack slowly. Dust rose in a pale cloud and settled back over everything. Inside lay a compact camera sealed in its waterproof sleeve, a folded paper map with hand-creased corners, a whistle on a red cord, and in the side pocket, the stitched tag that had stopped Jake's breath on the wall. Caleb Monroe. They handled the camera like a living thing. The memory card clicked free with a small, ordinary sound that felt anything but ordinary. Back at the station, a technician slid it into a reader, and the screen filled with small rectangles, thumbnails of the last hours of a family's life. The first photos were simple. 2 boys in ball caps making faces at each other. A low ridge, Laura's hand holding up a sandwich to the lens, James pointing toward a notch in the rock. Then the walls began to narrow. The frame lost sky. Shadows thickened at the edges. In one image, the boys stood in single file along a ledge, barely wider than their shoes, Ethan looking back at the camera to make sure Caleb was there. The water appeared slowly, as if it had been there all along and only now decided to show itself. Dark stains edged the rock a little higher in each frame. A trickle across the sand in one photo became a shining ribbon in the next. Pebbles disappeared. A dry channel turned glossy. The final sequence was quiet, almost tender. Ethan and Caleb stood shoulder to shoulder on a flat rock as if posing for their mother. Except Laura wasn't behind the lens. Ethan was. You could see his reflection faintly in the wet sheen at their feet. Caleb tried to smile. He always tried to smile. Beyond them, the canyon pinched to a throat of stone, and in that narrow place, the background blurred into a single brown surface. Not a wall, not yet, but the shape of one. The last photo carried a timestamp from the late afternoon of the second day. A thin line of froth traced across the lower corner, and behind the boys, the color deepened, not the blue of shadow, but the color of river water, turned with silt, moving fast. The next image slot was empty. While the photos loaded, the weather team pulled radar archives and storm reports from 9 years earlier. On the day the Monroes vanished, thunderstorms had built in a watershed far to the northeast, unseen from Marble Ridge. The rain fell hard in places no one on the rim could watch, and hours later, the runoff threaded into side canyons like this one, gathering speed where the rock tightened and the floor dropped. Flash floods don't arrive like rain. They arrive like time finally catching up. A hydrologist traced it on a map with a blunt pencil. Rainfall totals, slope gradients, the point where tributaries join and force water into a single course. In the narrow slot where the boys had stood, there would have been minutes, 3, maybe 5, between the first low roar and a moving wall that could lift boulders, strip trees, and erase footprints as if they'd never been made. Even seasoned river crews misjudged that kind of water. Hikers don't stand a chance. The fragments the team collected fit the story the camera told. The nylon scrap matched a corner seam found on compact tarps. The shoes wear pattern matched Caleb's gait in earlier photos. The pack's grit lined up with sediment from Serpent Fork's lower spillway, proof that items had traveled in floods over time, pausing where the canyon pinched and then lodged, the way wood sometimes wedges in a stream until the angle is just right to hold it forever. The investigators built the timeline gently, as if raising something fragile from the bottom of a lake. Day 1, a detour off the main trail, light fading, a night under a ledge. Day 2, a decision to follow the drainage, the old survival rule that water leads somewhere. It did lead somewhere. It just led there too quickly. They read the images aloud like testimony. Here is the ledge where they waited. Here, the water line that wasn't there an hour before. Here, the flat stone they chose because it looked safe and high. Here, the boys together. Here, the color that means the river is coming to you instead of waiting for you to come to it. The room stayed quiet long after the screen went dark. People cleared their throats and pretended to take notes, because writing is easier than feeling. Someone set the small shoe on a clean cloth as if returning it to its owner. There had been theories, wrong turns, risky choices, maps ignored, but the photos didn't care about theories. They showed a family doing what families do, staying together, moving carefully, choosing the place that looked a little safer than the last. They showed a canyon that can change its mind in minutes and take everything with it when it does. They didn't make a mistake. They were caught in something no map could warn them about. In the months that followed, the canyon changed in small but visible ways. New weather beacons rose along the less traveled trails, slender poles of steel crowned with blinking lights that caught the sun during the day and pulsed faintly after dark. Fresh signs appeared at every junction, warning in clear, simple words. Flash flood zone, even clear skies can kill. Park rangers began holding evening briefings at campgrounds, showing visitors how rain falling miles away could become a wall of water here. It wasn't fear they wanted to spread, it was respect. Respect for a landscape that was never meant to be tamed. At the dedication ceremony for the first beacon, Rachel Monroe stood beside the park superintendent, her hands folded tightly around a smooth river stone. The crowd was small: rangers, search and rescue volunteers, a few townspeople who remembered the summer of 2016. When it was her turn to speak, Rachel's voice was steady. "My brother James taught me to read maps," she said, "but the canyon has maps of its own, ones we can't draw. What happened to my family wasn't because they didn't prepare. It's because nature doesn't always negotiate." A breeze moved through the juniper trees as she placed the stone at the beacon's base. "If even one person turns back when the clouds start to build, that'll be enough." The foundation she created soon after, the Monroe Trust for Wilderness Safety, funded radio upgrades for park rangers, community training programs, and scholarships for students studying environmental science and emergency management. Its logo was simple: two concentric circles meant to represent both ripples in water and rings of time. Each year on June 12th, volunteers gathered at Marble Ridge for the Monroe Hike for Safety. They walked the same route the family had once taken, not in mourning, but in awareness. Rangers would stop along the trail to demonstrate how runoff channels form, how to read cloud buildup, how to know when to turn back. Rachel never missed a year. She walked near the front, quiet but smiling now, her silver hair pulled back, her compass still hanging at her neck. One reporter asked her during the 5th anniversary if she ever stopped being angry. She thought for a moment, looking out across the horizon where the canyon's colors met the sky. "I learned that anger is just grief with nowhere to go," she said, "so I gave it somewhere to go." For visitors who never knew the Monroes, their story became part of the canyon's living memory. Guides told it beside campfires. Teachers mentioned it in classrooms, not as a warning alone, but as a reminder that love and caution can coexist, that curiosity and humility should walk hand in hand. The canyon itself, of course, remained unchanged. The wind still hummed through the same stone corridors. The sun still painted the cliffs gold each morning. People still came to take pictures, to marvel, to stand at the edge and feel small. And somewhere below, beneath centuries of sediment and silence, lay the trace of one family's journey, a trail invisible but never truly gone. The canyon is ancient. It doesn't promise safety or mercy, but sometimes it lets us find meaning in what it takes away. And in that meaning, in the hands that build beacons, the voices that teach, and the hearts that keep remembering, the Monroes live on.